His Excellency the Minister of Finance of Brazil, Mr. Henrique Meirelles.
Let me ask you the same question, Susan, as yesterday. Hélio, the question is in Portuguese or English?
Portuguese. Okay. Great. Even easier for me. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here with you once again. At this meeting with the U.S. Business Council. Today's presentation will be important. It will be a presentation delivered specifically for the Council of the Americas. And the idea today is to talk about Brazil's economy. We must focus on the importance of fiscal adjustment. I was just at National Congress. I was there for a meeting that lasted 3 hours with a number of congressmen from PSDB. I also had meetings last week with other political parties such as PMDB, PSB, PP, PSD, and DEM this morning. We've scheduled a meeting with the Green Party, PV, for next week. Just to give you an idea how intense our upcoming agenda is, we'll be discussing this very topic. Much like last week, today we were discussing the pension reform, Social Security, but more specifically a pension reform. So let's get the presentation up on screen. Fiscal adjustment is a necessary condition to growth. I always attend presentations, luncheons, and a number of other functions with the Council. I've been working with the Council for a number of years, ever since I lived in New York. I lived there for a few years, and then I came back to Brazil and went to work at the central bank. And whenever possible, we would host meetings with the Council. We had many of these meetings at their New York headquarters. And these discussions have always been very productive, very fruitful, and interesting. So let's get started. This is the fiscal status of Brazil. This is the trajectory of total primary expenditures in Brazil dating back to 1991. It was 10.8% of the GDP. And now, in 2016, it's 19.8% of the GDP. In 2017, we're expecting over 20%. If this trajectory continues without an expenditure cap and without a pension reform, the trajectory would take primary expenditures to about 20 to 25%, up to 25% of the GDP. If we are to keep the deficit level at where it is today, we would need to change the fiscal regime in Brazil to the tune of 10% of the GDP. So you can only imagine what the consequences of that would be. Now, why 10%? Why this increase from 15 to 25%? Well, with the ceiling cap and the pension reform, we're expecting this number to drop to 15.5 rather than 25.4. So it's a difference of 10%. And this is equivalent to what was collected by means of taxes, effectively speaking. If we keep primary expenditures in the same trajectory as the last few years, in 2017, the expected primary deficit would be 139 million. If the trajectory holds, it would increase to 280 million reais in 2017. So you can imagine what that would represent. In a few decades, the Social Security pensions alone would also increase by 10% of the GDP. So first and foremost, if we add all of the expenditures, we will see a 10% increase in the GDP over the next 10 years, from 15 to 25%. So this is the scope of the fiscal adjustment we are carrying out in Brazil by approving or passing these measures for the next 10 years. Now, Social Security pension expenditures. The gradual reduction in Social Security means that 1.7% of the GDP will be saved in Social Security in the upcoming years. Now, let's look at short-term growth of expenditures and the deficit. Primary expenditures in Brazil have been going up, but for a period of time, they were funded by increased tax collection. So, between 2001, 2002, and 2010 approximately, the primary balance is quite relevant, 13.5% of the GDP. Then there was a sharp drop in 2009 and 2008 because of the crisis, and then it went up again. And then there's a consistent drop all the way down to where it is today. Last year, the total primary deficit was 154 billion reais at the federal level alone. So the public debt, the percentage of the public debt that was going down started going up as of 2014. And it reached a peak over 75% of the GDP in late last year, early this year. Now, the reason I mention this is because it largely explains the recession we are going through in Brazil. This recession came about as a result of a lack of confidence, which itself was triggered by increased uncertainty about the capacity of Brazil to pay its debts. This led to a drop in investments, a drop in employment, and a drop in consumption, and basically a vicious cycle which increased unemployment, decreased production, etc. Since late 2014, from late 2014 to late 2016, we've undergone the worst recession ever recorded in the country, even greater than the Great Depression of 1929. It's basically the worst recession on record. Now, here's the good news. The economy is beginning to recover. We expect to see growth in the first quarter of this year. The growth rate will be slightly positive. And if we compare that to the last trimester of, if we compare the last quarter of 2016 to what's expected for the last quarter of 2017, we expect a 2.7% increase. Once again, we're comparing the last quarters of the 2 years, 2016 and 2017. Now, if the growth rate for the last quarter of 2017 is maintained throughout the entire year, that means that our growth rate will be in excess of 3% in 2018. So we'll move from a recession of 3.6 to a growth stage of 3.6. Just 1 second, I have a call which I need to take. I apologize. It was short and painless. Okay, well, that said, let's look at the effects of all this. Let's look at confidence and how it relates to the crisis, both in terms of cause and consequence of it. As the crisis worsened, the country plunged into a recession, the sustainability came into question, and the sustainability of the country was harmed. The credit default swap, or CDS, is a good way to measure the country's stability, and it grew by about 500 points, equivalent to late 1990 levels. Meaning this is something Brazil hadn't seen in a long, long time. And then it dropped very quickly. It was a very sharp drop and has gone down under 200 points. It's on a downward trend. Confidence in the industry. It used to be high, and then in 2009, as a result of the crisis, it plunged. Then it came back up, and then it started dropping again until it reached this level, over 70. Once again, this is measured by the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, FGV. We also see a very quick recovery, starting about a year ago, when a new government administration was about to take office and implement austerity measures that would promote growth. That's when we saw a sharp increase. Then there was a drop, especially around August. It was going up, then it went down, so people were asking themselves how sustainable that increase was, and then it grew again, it rose again, and it's pointing up in the beginning of this year. Confidence, which had been going down since 2011, systematically also started going back up. Sorry, you're right. Sorry, we did many different presentations in quick succession. That makes everything very dynamic, but logistics are a bit more difficult going from one venue to another. Anyway, let's go back to the presentation. The reasons for slow recovery. This is the company's indebtedness and household indebtedness as a percentage of the income, looking more specifically at the second half of last year. As of 2011, we've seen a constant increase in the debt level of companies. So companies' indebtedness is shown on the left. This shows how the debt has been going up. This is once again net debt divided by equity. Now, there was constant growth here in this ratio, meaning that equity went down a little bit as a result of the crisis. So we saw a constant increase of the debt level, eventually peaking in the second quarter of last year.
And since then, there's been a drop, but obviously this delayed growth resumption because, well, companies are paying debts as a priority. They are obviously directing funds to that rather than to production of stocks and growth and investment. So what's the advantage? What's the good news here? It's that this relationship has already gone up to the same levels as 2007. So we have the process of unleveraging of the Brazilian economy from a business point of view is already going back to previous levels. And so we are building the conditions and quite close to growth conditions. Of course, this level has dropped a lot, which shows that the process goes on. And this is what delays the growth process. But the advantage is that this will allow companies to resume investments and growth because the tendency is for them to reach lower levels of indebtedness. For families, households follow the same trend, but with less pronounced curves because the drop in debt levels, the debt levels drop, but there isn't a change in the denominator. So this is what we see here. Household indebtedness also reached a peak, but is already dropping, which makes room for resumption. So when we see the process of unleveraging, a successful unleveraging process with the approval of the expenditure cap and Social Security reform already being discussed in Congress, with inflation dropping, allowing central bank to cut interest rates, we see a resumption of growth. Industry already showing positive signs of growth, and employment follows this resumption. So we see here industry very clearly is already recovering, going back to the same levels as 2013. Employment is follows a bit more slowly, but still growing. So there's been an inversion of the curve, and this is very important. And this is the message, the most relevant, the key message. As I mentioned, our growth projections we have a projection of 2.7% growth. And here I'm using a curve that compares one quarter with the same quarter in the previous year. And so how did this evolve in Brazil? We see here that we had very high rates here and a drop close to minus 5%. And here we have the projections for December 2017, 2.7%. So one trimester compared with the previous year's quarter, and so always comparing one quarter with the same quarter of the previous year and the evolution in this period. Another thing is the annualized rate. So if the growth in the last quarter of 2017 remains throughout 2018, this would mean growth above 3% in 2018. If we look now to business environment or ease of production in Brazil and other countries, this is related to the country's capacity to grow. What are the different reforms that we are conducting? First, the expenditure cap, which is very important to change the path of Brazilian debt and Brazilian expenditures. Social Security reform is an important part of this. Also, reforms aimed at increasing the country's capacity to grow at higher rates. And so we are talking about the labor reform, the tax reform, red tape reduction, rationalization of services, a range of measures. The World Bank establishes measurements comparing several countries. Here we see a country that has improved a lot in this aspect, Russia. Countries that have worsened, Peru, Mexico, a gradual improvement. Argentina, Brazil, stabilized, then dropped again. Brazil is not in a good position. We have announced a range of micro reforms aimed at increasing the country's capacity to produce better and produce more, improving national productivity. This is a theoretical comparison measure. Let's say Brazil improves at the same speed as Russia or the same speed as Mexico. If it improves at the same speed as Russia and the reforms are successful, we will reach an average of Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and countries in Latin America that have a better performance level. And we would achieve this in 3 years. If we improve at the same rate as Mexico, it will take us 10 years. In short, this is a very broad set of reforms that we are implementing with a lot of energy and advancing a lot in Brazil. This graph, I would like to summarize the results of the graph. There is a direct correlation between the World Bank e-business indicator, facility of production, ease of production in the country, and per capita income. The more productive a country is, the greater the per capita income. And here we have data from several countries around the world showing this correlation. So we should improve our per capita income as we successfully conduct our reforms. So we have reforms related to credit. I won't read all the specific measures. This presentation will be made available to you. I would like to draw attention to one, which is the positive registry. There is a law in Brazil determining the existence of the positive registry, showing that a citizen is a good payer and showing the credit history of an individual. But in order to be part of this positive registry, you have to register at the notary office, and few people do that because it's a lot of work, so it doesn't really work. But we are going to reverse this. Everybody will be in the positive registry unless someone doesn't want their credit history to be revealed, and so they ask to leave the registry. But this is an important inversion. We are changing the law on bankruptcy and creating electronic duplicates, and we are also looking to finance the real estate market in the long term. Also a labor reform that I already mentioned, and tax reform, which is very important, and also the rationalization and facilitation of the tax payment methodology. Just to give you an example, today a company spends in Brazil about 2,600 hours a year just to pay taxes. The aim is to cut this to a quarter of this number of hours. We've already dropped to 2030, but in a year we want to lower this to a quarter of the original figure. Therefore, we have a range of reforms. I will mention another example. The e-social for registering and processing payments and contributions electronically, and also municipal tax, paying municipal taxes. And another example, today in São Paulo, the average amount spent for opening, or the average number of days for opening a company is 101, and we intend to reduce that to less than 5 days in the next 2 years. So these are many efforts. I just want to show you how broad the work is, the work we are doing. It's not only about fiscal stabilization and monetary stabilization. There is a huge list of reforms that are being conducted, and intense work by several areas, so that the country can resume growth at higher rates. Very well. For international trade, the same agenda, creation of the single portal of foreign trade. And so when you export, when you get to the port, everything is processed through a single portal. All the documentation is entered, and the goods can be processed, and also a reduction of the time required to fill out all the forms, and so it's a 40% reduction. Today it takes 4 to 5 days. Under discussion at the Congress also is the permission for the purchase of land by foreigners. In some sectors, this is important. And other changes in terms of liberalization of the economy, creating conditions for Brazil to grow more. Changes in rules governing concessions, with the creation of predictable rules, stable rules, and a lot of movement towards this. And also the preference margin is very important in this process of government procurement, and also reforms in oil and gas sectors with horizontalization of the national content rules, changing procedures in terms of production, exploitation, and so on, and other rules for state-owned companies, pension funds, greater autonomy for regulatory agencies. I'm mentioning all this very quickly because it is a very long list of measures. And the idea here is not to present each measure at length, This material will be made available to you. The idea is just to give you an idea of how broad the reforms being conducted in Brazil are. I left 3.5 hours of discussions at the Chamber of Representatives. It was very interesting, very intensive, very intense on Social Security reform. And I came here, and I'm leaving here, going back to the Chamber of Representatives to continue the discussion. But today, what we have in the news is Social Security reform. But I want to show you that that's not the only thing. There's a long list of reforms at the macro level involving fiscal issues, macroeconomics, monetary policy, inflation, falling interest rates, and so on. But there are also micro changes in credit, in judicial recovery, and fiscal recovery of the states, facilitation of fiduciary alienation, and so there are many difficulties in this area currently in Brazil. And so what is the net effect? Less credit and more expensive interest. So we want to create more credit, lower interest rates for the country to continue growing.
Well, the country is already growing. We just want it to grow even more. Just to give you an idea, just to conclude, this is what we faced. We used to be in a recession, now we're resuming growth. People are looking at the numbers and trying to figure out when we become sustainable. So what is the level deemed sustainable across the years? Well, perhaps currently it would be about 2.5% growth. The government would be reducing its participation in the GDP. It would no longer crowd out to the private sector, but rather it would crowd in by drawing in more funding for investment, etc. That in itself may increase the potential growth rate by 0.6, 0.7%. All these measures to promote growth, reduce bureaucracy, improve credit, pretty much all pro-growth measures to increase Brazil's growth rate. All of these can contribute to an increase, an average increase of 0.6, 0.7, or even 0.8% in the upcoming years. So by next year, we will put in place an intense program of reforms that will enable Brazil to grow and eventually reach a sustainable growth rate close to 4% in future years. So this is our reform program. It's rather intense, rather ambitious. You can tell by my own agenda. I mean, I go to one presentation after another, one venue after another, and I use many different methodologies to get this across to many people. But basically, in a nutshell, things are going well. The economy is recovering. Reforms are approved, and we are hard at work. And I think it will be worth it in the end, because the country will be better positioned to grow even more inclusively, and more sustainably in the years to come at a much higher growth rate. Thank you, and I wish you all success.